Welcome, everyone. Good evening. My name is Stephen Norris, and I'm the director of the Havinghurst Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies here at Miami University in Ohio. I'm pleased to be joined by Peter Pomerantsev for our latest event in our Focused on Ukraine series. I'll ask Peter some questions for 35 to 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for audience questions. First, let me introduce our guest. Peter Pomerantsev is a senior fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, where he co-directs the ARENA initiative, a research project dedicated to overcoming the challenges of digital era disinformation and polarization. Between 2017 and 2020, he was a senior fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science. His 2014 book on Russian propaganda, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, was translated into over a dozen languages, dramatized on BBC Radio, and won the 2016 Royal Society of Literature Andadje Prize. His next book, This Is Not Propaganda, was released in August 2019 and was named a Times Book of the Year. Pomerantsev has testified on the challenges of information war and media development to the US House Foreign Affairs Committee, the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the UK Parliament Defense Select Committee. He was a specialist advisor on the UK Parliamentary Committee on Fake News and was a member of the USC Annenberg's Transatlantic Working Group on Internet Content Moderation and Freedom of Expression. He's a columnist at the American Interest and writes for publications including the New York Times and The Atlantic. Finally, Pomerantsev co-founded and co-directs the Reckoning Project, which aims to document Russian war crimes in Ukraine and prepare for holding those who committed them legally accountable. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. And let me start with this work on the Reckoning Project, particularly after last week when a UN panel announced their findings on war crimes committed by Russian troops in Ukraine. Can you tell us how this project came about and what sort of work is being done on the ground?
Sure. I mean, the project was sort of birthed as myself, a very well-known war reporter, Janine Di Giovanni, who's covered really all the major genocides and wars since Yugoslavia, and the Ukrainian journalist Natalia Kumeniuk. We were kind of wondering what we do in the first days of the invasion and how we put together what we did already, which is we have a very strong network of journalists that we worked with for many years in Ukraine on different projects, but how we really make that high impact given the challenges we're facing, and something that really the core of the project in terms of activities is taking a whole this incredible network of journalists we have all across Ukraine, and essentially and giving them training so that when they gather evidence as they go across the country, that evidence would then also be permissible in courts of law. So I think it's part of a larger movement that's looking at the gathering of evidence in a much broader way, because now we have in the modern world you have people using social media gathering war crimes evidence, first responders like emergency services. You have people doing OSINTs, sitting in their bedrooms and sort of picking out mass graves and stuff. So we've got this incredible opportunity in today's world to gather evidence that is so much greater than during the days of Yugoslavia. For example, the Yugoslav war, but it's actually not very professional. And so it's part of this larger push to sort of make evidence gathering more rigorous and more usable. But I think behind that is a much larger kind of sort of ideological sort of contest, which is how do we battle for truth in a time of post-truth, and how do we battle for these big words that we like to throw around like justice and accountability and memory in a time when truth is fragmented and memory is dissipating. And where justice seems pointless. We live in an age of impunity. So that's, there's a much larger, I think, kind of like philosophical mission there. But the practical thing is just training journalists, who are often the first people at the crime scene, to make sure that they gather evidence in a way that isn't just great for journalism, but that is also not just great for journalism, but it is also permissible in courts of law.
What are some of the stories that they've uncovered so far? Some of the ones that have surprised you the most, perhaps?
So a lot of the time, it's not about uncovering. A lot of the time, it's about going deeper. So we're not trying to do breaking news, quite the opposite. We're thinking like a year ahead or 2 years ahead even. So it's about going deeper. So we're quite the opposite. We're doing the opposite. As the news cameras move on, we're staying there. So we're doing big stories about a cellar in Yakhidne where 300 people were kept prisoner by the Russians. We're doing stories about places like Chernihiv that was forgotten about. There's like some of the earliest destruction of civilian infrastructure and residential homes was in Chernihiv in the first weeks of the war. Like nobody covered it because it was occupied. The agenda moved on, and so we're taking the time to go through every life that was lost, go through all the proofs that show that this was an indiscriminate attack on civilians. So a lot of the time it's not about doing the opposite. It's not breaking. Everyone's looking to break. We're like, stop, slow down, go deeper, make sure we've gathered this. But I suppose that the main editorial innovation that we're doing in terms of storytelling, because this is about storytelling as well, is really trying to frame this in the context of Putin's other wars. So we're doing the story of Mariupol, like many other people are, but we're going to frame it in a way that looks at the siege of Aleppo and of Grozny. So really, we're trying to sort of build up a case in the court of public opinion, showing that this is something that the Russian regime does systemically and across many theaters.
That's a good segue, because speaking of storytelling, you recently authored an article for The Guardian that argued in part that Putin continues to shape perceptions about the war, particularly on the efficacy of sanctions. So my question is, how can the West combat this war of perception? It seems hard when influential voices such as Tucker Carlson and Viktor Orban, both of whom you name in the piece, but also many others on the opposite spectrum who see this as NATO's fault. So how can we combat this war of perception?
Well, look, I mean, like you have to, you have to go audience by audience, select the audiences that matter, why they matter, and really understand them and their, what informs them. This sort of thing requires a sort of a structured and research approach. There is no magic bullet. It's about dedicating yourselves to it. The question is, whose job is it in many ways? Whose job is it to do that? Whose job is it to reach audiences inside of Russia? Whose job is it to reach Tucker Carlson audience in the US? And we live in this strange world where it's unclear whose job it is, frankly. To reach inside of Russia in the Cold War or the Second World War, you'd have had, various government bodies that were trying to do that through, overt and covert means, frankly. But it's no one's job at the moment. And so what I was sort of speculating was that what could be the role of civic actors in this space? Because we live in a world where anyone can do an information campaign, whether a really dirty and nasty one like ISIS or a very good one like, I don't know, like Me Too. So and those are civic movements in their own way. My question was that if governments are slow, ineffectual, hesitating, too shy in some ways to take this on, then what would be the role for kind of civic information campaigns to try and do this? And I think that's probably a way forward, not the only way forward, but a way forward. Because media certainly aren't going to do it. Media have no interest in this. Media talk to their little tribe and make money talking to their little tribe. There's zero impetus for the MSNBC to reach out to the Fox News viewer. I mean, that's not their job. They don't care. So it has to be somebody else's job.
How do you build one of these civic organizations in Russia today?
Oh, I mean, in Russia, they can be partly inside, partly outside. I mean, it's compared to the Cold War, it's very easy. I mean, you can still reach people. The YouTube is still working in Russia. Telegram is still working in Russia. It's not China. There's no firewall. There's some blocks on sites like Facebook, but they're easily surmountable. So delivery is not a problem. Funding, intentionality, and sort of really research that tries to understand the connection between information, public opinion, and political change is very hard. But that shouldn't be a reason not to try.
I want to shift for a second and reference another article you wrote, this for the New York Times in the late summer, where you wrote that Putin is building, or has even partly built already, an empire of humiliation. Can you explain this a little bit more, and also explain how this term helps us understand the war on Ukraine?
So really good. That was actually an essay I spent months working on. It's one of those ones that sort of, it's funny. The Guardian piece, I think I did in one morning, and the New York Times one I did over maybe a couple of months, and they probably have the same amount of readerships. Journalism is very cruel. There is absolutely no balance between the amount of effort put in and the amount of coverage something gets. I mean, I know that essay did very well, the humiliation one, but I did one for The Guardian the other day, and I literally spent 1.5 hours on it, and I got more traction than anything else. Journalism is very fickle. But that one is one that I really cared about, the New York Times one. So I'm glad you've mentioned it, and I think it's called Putin's Empire of Humiliation or something. Look, what I was trying to get to was clearly the subjugation of Ukraine is a colonial project. Putin talks about it that way, really quite openly. But I wanted to ask, what sort of empire is it? You know, is it the Soviet Empire was built on ideology? The Russian Empire before it was built on a bit like the British Empire, an idea of kind of conquering, but also enlightening. It was meant to be like, we are the great white people bringing civilization to the little people. I mean, really just covered up lots of brutality, but there was still an idea there that was used and exploited in various ways. And not very much, not dissimilar to other European empires which frame their activity this way. So you could talk about economic empires. A lot of the time it was like the rhetoric of we're going to enlighten people, but actually it's just like basically extracting wealth from them. The invasion of Ukraine doesn't work in any of those ways. I mean, there's no real attempt at a serious sort of like ideological project. It falls up, it changes every 2 seconds, like what the ideology is meant to be. There's some verbiage about the Russian world and great Russian culture, but it's completely self-contradictory. It makes economic zero sense, absolutely no sense at all. What he's doing is completely economically self-destructive. So I'm trying to get to what is it really about? And I kind of looked at that really what we're talking about are psychological reasons. The desire to subjugate others, and I sort of root that in a Russian political culture which is based on humiliating its own citizens. Even the elites, even the oligarchs are humiliated in Russia. Like nobody has a sense that they have stable power and rights. I mean, the definition of humiliation or humiliating someone is making them feel powerless. Yeah. So it's a culture of constantly humiliating people at work, in the home. And then in so many ways, I think one of the interesting things in the Putin regime the last few years has been laws they passed that made it okay to beat your wife or husband at home and to beat your children. So I mean, literally legalizing domestic abuse, saying this is what we're about. We are defined by being abusers. And we can talk about the prison culture, the office culture, the culture of humiliating people in the army. I mean, it goes on and on and on. It's a culture that's built in it, and historically, of course, it's been there, and that culture of humiliation then sort of is compensated for by humiliating others, by humiliating minorities or other countries. And I thought it was very interesting that the people that the Russia sends to humiliate the Ukrainians are its own humiliated minorities. The minorities are sent to sort of, the shock troops of the invasion. And I get into sort of the details of that. So I mean, that really presupposes a sort of a sadomasochistic cycle. And a lot of the rhetoric of the Russian invasion is also very masochistic, which is, I think, a very, very big part of this cycle. So that's what I try to get to, this cycle of humiliation and aggression, of sadism, masochism, and sadism again. I sort of looked at how that's reflected in the propaganda and the rhetoric, which does have a pattern. Ideologically, it doesn't make very much sense. There's a new political reason for the invasion every day, but there is an underlying emotional cycle that keeps on repeating. And I look at Putin as sort of part of the power of his propaganda and of his performances on TV, is that he plays both sides of this humiliation drama. He's both the sort of humiliated Russian everyman. He's sort of like, physically he becomes like this little guy. He's like being bullied by everyone, which is an old Russian literary idea as well, like the little guy who's humiliated, in his case, by the West, by history, and then suddenly he swells up to be this avenger who's like, yes, I was humiliated like you, and now I shall crush others, and I will frighten others, and I will bully others. And so I sort of speculated, it's very hard to prove these things, that's maybe part of his power, that he's managed to sort of perform both sides of this dynamic, both the humiliated and the humiliator. So that was the essay, and there's a lot of resonances with Nazi propaganda, which also was based around a sort of a sadomasochistic cycle, but there's much about it which is uniquely Russian, I think, as well.
You've just invoked the P word, propaganda, as a way of explaining this culture of humiliation, which is, of course, the subject of your two books. That is the Putinist propaganda system and how it compares to other current propaganda systems in the world. So thinking about it and thinking about all this work you've done on it, what are the main traits beyond the culture of humiliation that you see as particularly important in the current Putinist propaganda system? And how, if at all, does it differ from previous iterations of Soviet and Russian propaganda?
Yeah, I mean, look, we can see trends which are very, very similar across the world. And my second book, This Is Not Propaganda, was all about that. It's an around the world book where I sort of see the patterns that I see across the world, with Russia kind of as a leader in these things for many reasons. But really we see the patterns repeating over and over and over. So if you look at the similarities, and again, this is very, very similar to the 1920s and 30s, again, throughout the world. But, you know, the Nazis and the Soviets really took this to a real extreme. The collapse of old identities, the collapse of old stable social roles, economic identities, but also ideas of, you know, the way history is meant to develop and where a person situates themselves in history. That has been collapsing recently, much as it collapsed in the 1920s. So Hannah Arendt's great book, Origins of Totalitarianism, is all about this, really. Or one chapter of it is all about this, chapter 10. If any of your students are into a bit of masochism themselves, they can try to read it. But that's all about how in the 1920s in Germany and the Soviet Union, you know, the old type of society collapses, you know, sort of the peasant society with an aristocracy and so on. And suddenly you have people swelling into the cities, and it's very late industrialization in both countries. And they lose all their old classes and sense of self, and the old sort of systems collapse, and people are in this flux, not knowing who they are. And in this flux, the Nazis and the Soviets mold them into, you know, the masses, basically, redefine who they are. And it's very interesting talking to sort of propagandists in Russia and other countries who operate now all say the same thing. The old social identities has collapsed, whether you're in rural America and your social status has collapsed because you're, you know, it's not just that there's no work, it's just what you did no longer exists. You know, it's like a complete vacuum about who you are and what your identity is and what your place in the country is. Or whether you're in the northeast of Britain, where whole ways of life have disappeared and whole identities have disappeared the last decades, or whether you're in, you know, in bits of I don't know, maybe other good examples are in bits of Latin America. I look at populism in Latin America as well. So you have all these societies which are going through rapid change because of globalization, because social and economic change, but also because of media change as well. You know, our identities are sort of contained within and reflected by traditional media, for better or worse. And now you have the social media world where people have to sort of reinvent themselves anew. So we're in this sense of flux and sense of what some sociologists call a liquid modernity. And in that moment of flux, where all the old definitions have gone, the skilled propagandist steps in and creates a new idea of the people, the mass. In Russia, it was a creation of something called the Putin majority, which almost became this sort of blob that was meant to include everybody in society, apart from those who were defined as the enemies. And again, this is not dissimilar to what happened in the 20s and 30s. So in that sense, a lot of similarities. That sort of social chaos and the skilled propagandist gives people a sense of political identity, someone to hate, someone to look up to, and a cure for loneliness. I think the best description of what propaganda is it's a cure for loneliness. This is a line from Jacques Ellul, who's one of my favorite philosophers of propaganda. And, I think conspiracy theories serve that very well. They're always, that's what repeats over and over and over between Russia and Latin America and bits of the US, is conspiracy theories have become the kind of glue that holds this new blob together, which might not have very much in common in terms of their sort of ideologies or even interests, but they're held together by conspiratorial worldviews. Conspiracies are very good for defining the us and the them. So those are the sort of the similarities between the 1920s and now. The dissimilarities is that I think in the 1920s and 30s, you have much clearer and more almost religious ideologies. So whether it's Nazism or communism, with a various very serious kind of construction and idea of history. And now everything is much more liquid and is constantly transforming. And in a way, the ideology's fallen apart to reveal pure psychology. And that's reflected both in things that I've talked about Putin's project being one about emotional and psychological compensation rather than ideological drives. But I think it's also in the reality of how you do propaganda today. You do propaganda by, doing psychological profiles of groups of society, getting them to react in very emotional ways, doing your campaigns to reinforce various types of sentiment analysis. That's what you do all day. You sit around trying to measure sentiment. So that was always a big part of propaganda, but there was a lot more ideology before. You were dealing with ideas and arguments. There's much less of that now. Just the daily work of the propagandist is much more on the pure sort of emotion level, and that's that's both a product and a producer of an age where sort of we don't seem to be that as invested in a battle of big complex ideas as we used to be.
I'll propagandize briefly for your book. Everything is true, or nothing is true and everything is possible. And I was struck in your book how you describe the postmodern dictatorship, the Putinist propaganda system, as one that uses the language and institutions of capitalism for authoritarian ends, and also how it uses language from the West to play and almost taunt with the West from within, notions of truth, for example. So do you think that the system has evolved that is the Putinist propaganda system evolved in any interesting ways, or any ways we should pay attention to? And of course, I'm also struck by the fact you had a bird's eye first person view to it, working in Russian television for several years in the early 2000s.
Yeah, I think it's definitely changed. If evolved is the right word. It's definitely deformed even further. Before, when I was living there, it was when I was living there, we'd already had the Chechen War and the invasion of Georgia. So I left in 2010. My book ends in 2014. So you already had this movement from dangerous, playful cynicism to cosplaying fascism like you have now. But no, definitely, I captured a snapshot in time, which is a prequel to what we see now. There's definitely a change. We've gone from this sort of, as you say, they were kind of imitating democracy and taunting democracy. They don't even pretend to be in a democracy now. That's completely fallen away. So then you'd have parties and you had elections, which were, if not competitive, they were meant to look competitive in this kind of weird way. Now they don't even bother with any of that. And it's gone from, before you switch on TV and there are people from different parties debating, having different opinions, there's much less of that today. You can actually have debates on TV, but they're much more designed to be between, the people versus the enemy. You'll have someone who represents the enemy on TV and everyone piles onto them. So it's changed, but a lot darker, a lot more aggressive. Before it was still playing footsie with the West and saying, oh, we'll join the West in our own way. Now it doesn't even claim to do that. So it's much more aggressive. The big change flows came in 2012, the big protests against Putin in Moscow, which genuinely rattled him. And after that, there was a real switch. Before that, I'll give you an example, maybe in one example that's more concrete. Before 2012, a lot of the sort of TV hosts, the most popular TV hosts, were kind of very elite and aspirational. You want to aspire to be like them. They were sophisticated, well-dressed, urbane, multilingual, culturally Western leaning. And then after that, again, look, it's a phase thing, obviously, but after that, the inflection changes towards these political talk show hosts who had always been there, but really hadn't been that much big of a deal. But they were suddenly elevated. They were given the primetime slots. They were given way more time. And their approach is completely different. They speak in a way that's consciously aggressive, unpleasant, very, very violent, very, very threatening. So if before you had these sort of like sophisticated sort of urban wits, I'm trying to think of somebody in America who's like that, Jon Stewart or something like that, that kind of style. Now you had something that was really, really nasty. And that was a way of legitimizing nastiness, you know. That was a way of saying, okay, the new style is about anger and about sadism, and all the anger and resentment and sadism you feel, we're now going to legitimize those feelings. We're going to really, you don't have to aspire to be anything anymore. You don't have to speak many languages and get great degrees. You don't need any of that. Just be as angry as us and as vicious as us. And that change in tone was really, really striking. And then it kind of builds up and builds up and builds up. And then from 2014, which is the invasion of Ukraine, it becomes sort of hegemonic.
It also seems it relies a lot on almost an oversaturation of, you know, World War II victory messaging about sacrifice, defending the motherland, the value of dying for the motherland. This is something that you wrote about in your more recent Guardian editorial, the one that took you only an hour and a half. How harmful is this oversaturation, and what, you know, how can you describe it and fit it into this Putinist system?
Well, it's the classic one. I mean, if we're going to make the comparison to the Nazis, Nazi propaganda was all about this. It was about noble sacrifice for the great cause and martyrdom. So there's several things going on here. One of them is, again, I think this masochism thing. So it's a society where the Kremlin has always humiliated, well, definitely the colonies, but also the center. Also humiliates its own people, and the cultural way to deal with that is to say, oh, we enjoy it. You know, we love struggle, we love suffering. And so at least the classic definition of masochism is that the bullied start to have to enjoy it in order to survive it. And so the Kremlin is, you know, what the Kremlin keeps on sort of whipping up is like, oh, the West wants to give us sanctions. Oh, we love that. You know, give us more. We love the suffering. And that resonates with people. You know, propaganda works and it resonates with people's deepest needs and emotional needs and drives. So that resonates. It's very perverse, but it works. But it works at the level of a kind of rhetoric. You know, this is the weird thing about this society. So on TV, there's all the drama of sacrifice and us against the world and how much everybody loves it. But the moment it becomes real and mass mobilization is announced, people just freak out. They're like, what? It's meant to be a movie. Because really what's going on is something else. Is, you know, people feel humiliated and they kind of compensate for it by these various psychodramas on TV, both playing out a masochism, which makes them feel better about themselves, playing out, you know, patriotic victories, but people are actually very, very demotivated. It's being sort of broken and broken and broken for centuries. You know, they're very depoliticized. They kind of have an allergy to any kind of mobilization, whether political or civic, etc. So now he suddenly announced mobilization, and people are very, very confused. I mean, we'll see how it plays out. I mean, people are also so passive that they might just go along to their deaths. But certainly we've seen 300,000 people leave in the first few days. That's quite a lot of people, most of whom, well, we don't really know who they are, but most of whom I would guess were not very politicized before. So you know, it's a society where TV is used as a place where you can play out your various psychodramas, but they've always struggled with motivation. Even in the big rallies that Putin holds, and here they are very different to the Nazis. There's no genuine enthusiasm. People are bussed in, they're paid to go. You know, it's usually people who work in state companies, state factories, schools, they're bussed into these rallies. I remember talking to one of the creators of the Putin propaganda system, and him telling me that was always their problem. They could not get people motivated. They could get people sitting on the couch and sort of cheering from the couch, but they couldn't actually get them out on the streets. That was just a permanent issue that they had.
Maybe a related question, but one that brings it out, this question a little more broadly. One of the themes that runs through your writing is that one of the problems it seems that Russia faces is a problem with its memories, its historical memories particularly. That is not just confronting the past properly, but the ability to manipulate the past for political ends. Can you speak a little bit more about this? Tell us a little more about how you see this as a major problem.
Yeah, I mean, there hasn't even been an attempt. I mean, I live in America now, which is a country with deep, deep, deep issues in its past, but you know, it's debating them and fighting them and losing them sometimes, but it's definitely engaged with them. And imagine you lived in a culture where no one even talked about slavery. No one talks about it, as if it never happened. Or it kind of happened, but you never discuss it. So Russia isn't a country which has no kind of, I mean, it doesn't even have any museums to the Gulag anymore. Like tens of millions died. There used to be one museum in Perm that was shut. All the institutions of history and memory being shut down. Absolutely no understanding of its own colonial history at all. If you go, you know, southern Russia, what is now Sochi, and I know how well your students know southern Russia. You ask most, I mean, this was a piece of the world that was inhabited by many tribes from the Caucasus, but you know, most notably the Circassians. And in the 19th century, the Russians came and ethnically cleansed them. No Russians know about it. You go and ask, like, who do you think used to live in southern Russia? And they're like, well, Russians. They're like, you're like, no, that only happened in the mid 19th century. What are you talking about? There's just complete amnesia, just complete lack of knowledge about really the basics of history. But instead, history is used as a kind of warped nostalgia, as a kind of weird Disneyland of kind of warped, they're not really memories, warped psychological highs and claims to great victories. And that's very damaging, full stop, but it's very damaging in Russia because there's no point where Russia starts to deal with the traumas that were caused by its history, both the ones against ethnic Russians and even more so against the ones against non-ethnic Russians. And it can't, you know, it can't get over the past because it can't deal with it. Psychoanalysts will tell you that people who don't deal with past traumas are kind of stuck and endlessly repeating the pain and going over it, but have no way to distance themselves from it. I mean, the history of cultural trauma is that you sort of excavate the past, you decide who's responsible, who was the victim, you learn the lessons, you move on. And it's very hard, but in Russia, there's not even an attempt to do this. So it remains the culture just like walking around its own traumas, dragging others into its own traumas without any attempt to kind of move beyond them and exploited very cynically as well. I mean, all Russians have this sense of trauma inside every family, often very, very confusing because a lot of people will have family members who are both victims and perpetrators. They're both KGB and Gulag inmates. You know, that's quite common to have all those histories playing out at the same time and all those contradictions. And there's no attempt to resolve them, but there's this gnawing sense of dread and horror. And in its own way, it's a very repressed society, deeply repressed. For all its bravura, it's actually very, very repressed. And what's that lovely line? The less you know, the better you sleep. It's a famous sort of Russian proverb. And there's definitely no impetus in the culture to discuss the past and try to excavate it. But the pain is there and the psychological damage is there, and that makes people very, very vulnerable. And that can be exploited very, very easily by the state. So it's a very, very sick society, as many societies are, but it makes no attempt to move on from it, to heal itself, and to envision itself anew. And it's been very noticeable that, you know, it can't imagine a future because of that. You know, it can't deal with the past and it can't move onto the future. And so it's just stuck in this weird sort of grotesque cosplays around its own pain and the pain it causes others. I've got an essay coming out in Time about this, which I'll gladly send on. So that's a pretty unhealthy place to be. And I think maybe in some ways very, very self-destructive as well, but a sort of self-destruction that pulls others into it. I don't know if anybody here has lived or knows, has lived around people with mental illness. It's, there's always this thing of pulling others into that vortex. And something much similar might be happening now with this war, trying to sort of drag Ukraine and others into the vortex of its own agony.
And it's these warped memories or inabilities to confront the past or manipulate the past that in part explain Putin's rationale for war. So let me ask my last question, then we'll turn to some audience questions. Please do type them in the chat. You've traveled to Ukraine since the war began. Can tell us a little bit about what you've seen and maybe what we can do, that is we here in the US listening to you, what we can do to help. Well,
firstly, the US is doing a huge amount, and thank God for that. So the US is having one of its good wars. It's had plenty of bad ones, but it's having one of its good ones. And I think a lot of that is because of the people, because there's genuine sympathy from normal people and ordinary people, and politicians see that and feel that themselves, I think. The thing that I worry about a little bit as we move forward is I still think we're framing this war as the plucky little Ukrainians fighting the big bad Russians. And that's only part of the story. It's part of what's going on, obviously. But Putin wants to bring down, whatever you want to call it, sort of like the world order built on rights, the rights of states and the rights of people. That's a very intentional thing that he's been doing since 2008, really. That's articulated. Him and many other similar powers, most notably China, do want a different type of world, and it's one where democracy is definitely not the dominant model. So, and this is very much like one front in that conflict, and Putin very much sees himself at war with us, with the West, with Europe, with America. That's his vision, and that's what he aims for. I mean, they talk about this quite openly. So I think it's important that we recognize that whether we like it or not, there is a force at war with us. We'll let China experts talk about how China views this, but they're at war with us in different ways. Through using energy, weapons to raise the cost of living. Part of the reason the cost of living is so high, one of them, there are many, but one of them is what Putin is doing with a lot of intentionality. His aim is to hurt us, doing it by holding the global south hostage to hunger, so using food as a weapon. And now he will move towards using nuclear threats as a weapon. And we'll see that intensifying over the next months, and things might get quite hairy. So he sees himself at war with us. It's not like, oh, give me Ukraine and then I'll be nice to you. He sees himself at war with us. And we don't like to think about that, because once you realize you're at war with someone, you've got to take all these really annoying measures, and it can be economically quite uncomfortable. And also you have to recognize it. And in Europe especially, where I think this is even more important, but I think also in America, I don't think we've quite got to the 21st century yet. We're still kind of playing out fantasies from the end of the 20th century about the inevitable victory of democracy and the inevitable path towards greater prosperity, and that the whole world has learned to believe in sort of frames of mutual interest, where America is the arbiter, and all this stuff. And that's just not the world that we're in. We're in a world of resurgent dictatorships who think that they can make globalization work for them. And this is going to be the fight of the century, and people have just got to start getting into a war mood. I'm sorry to break this to people, but it's going to get very, very, very ugly and very tough, and not necessarily kinetic. It might not involve American soldiers. I hope it doesn't. But this is just the start, I'm afraid.
So let me turn to some questions from audience members in the chat, and also encourage others to type some in. One question, it seems propaganda worked well before Putin announced mobilization. And the question is, can we say that propaganda worked well in virtual reality, but brutal reality can then change the perception of propaganda and Putin himself?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So it's a brilliant question. So the last sort of month or 2 months, independent Russian journalists, Ukrainians, have all been trying to think, how do we get through to the really very important socially sort of middle class in the big cities, in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Ekaterinburg, who Putin does fear. He does fear that this middle class rebels because they have a lot of weight. There's not that many of them in numbers, but they have a lot of weight. How do we get through to them that this war is for real? You know, because they always seem to be living in a dream where, you know, they're going to their parties and their art exhibitions, and the war is just something on TV. And then Putin goes and does it himself. Like, what the hell? It's like, you know, all these people trying to think, how do you communicate reality to them? And boom, it hits them. And he's done it himself. And it's very, very strange. I mean, it goes against everything that he's been trying to do really for the since 2014. So I don't know what the consequences are yet. I think that he could be miscalculating in his propaganda strategy, just as he did in his military strategy. So he may have gambled that people would be mobilized or something. There was genuine enthusiasm. Maybe he mistook the movie for the reality. And maybe he's gambling on that, and he's got it wrong. And that's consequential for him, not in the sense that it leads to protests, not in the sense that he loses an election, but in a much more subtle way. All politics in Russia is court politics. And the people Putin really fears aren't the West or anyone else, but it's like the guy 5 doors down to him who he thinks wants his job. So in terms of court politics, the emblem of being a Tsar, of being the leader, is that you can control public opinion through propaganda and fear. You know, the fact that you can keep it at 80% support shows that you're in charge. And the minute you've lost control of that, it sort of shows that, oh my God, you're losing your touch. So it is consequential. Don't necessarily expect to be, I'd be great if there were, but don't necessarily expect there to be sort of like huge protests throughout Russia. What's more important is the other people in the elite going, oh, the old man's losing his touch. That is much more consequential. Or a lot of Putin's addresses aren't even to the public. They're to somebody else in the court. They're signaling to somebody else in the court, and it can be very hard for us to work out who or why. So that's very interesting. I mean, the other thing, which is not more alarming, but definitely eyebrow raising, is he might now be at this point of desperation where he just doesn't care even about this. He's just in his final charge. He's got a winter, as far as he's concerned, of influence. It's the last winter that Russia has an energy chokehold over Europe. It's his last chance to lose his allies and assets in the world. There's still some money in the bank to bribe, pay off, cajole, dangle the possibility of pleasant investments for big American business, and so on and so forth. And so he's just going to go for it over winter. Maybe he just sees this as his last winter of where he really has any international muscle left. Because beyond that, whether rightly or wrongly, he might think that Europe becomes energy independent and Russia just starts becoming such a pariah. The last Russia sympathizers in the American business elites, in the European business elite, just lose interest a little bit. There's no money to be made out of it anymore. So he might just be like on a crazy charge, and he might just have stopped caring about public opinion. So I don't know. It's very hard to read, really, but it is consequential, and it's a very good question.
Second question from an audience member. If propaganda is solely about emotional appeals, then the question is about voting in the entire fabric of politics itself. Don't appeals to pathos saturate everything that deals with power? And how is propaganda therefore different than the day-to-day politics of government? Or even in a follow-up, doesn't propaganda as a technique of persuasion touch all things, even this talk?
Yeah, I don't, by the way, I don't, firstly, what do you mean by propaganda? If we just take it as a neutral definition of any type of mass persuasion, obviously it touches everything. Most serious philosophers of propaganda will say propaganda is communication in a complex society. That's what it is. Yeah. So obviously it touches everything. I completely reject Aristotle generally, and certainly the division between pathos and logos. I think that's one of the stupidest things that Aristotle came up with. and really speaks to a kind of only academics like, I mean, Aristotle would have just been like the worst of all academics. I'm sort of making these pathetic distinctions about things which in the real world are always together. And I teach a course about propaganda at Hopkins, and one of the first things I do is show people the photographs about the Great Depression, the famous photographs about people suffering in the Great Depression in the US, which are amazing photographs, which really tell of human suffering and empathy, which was sponsored by the US government in order to, inspire the cause for a New Deal. And I asked them, is this propaganda? So of course, like the idea that you would separate emotion from logos is nothing in the world has ever worked that way. I strongly reject Habermas's idea of a public sphere, of an elite rational discourse, which is made in danger by emotion. So I can reject the whole package of thinking that claims that. And if you look at history, it never existed. This is only someone like Habermas or Aristotle could think about the good as pure reason and the evil as emotion. An absurd idea. What I'm talking about is slightly different. What I'm talking about is that the balance of propaganda strategy has changed. And that's really got less to do with thoughts versus feelings and more to do with people's sense of whether there is a rational idea and course to history. So one of the things I look at a lot is this what's known as sort of a post-truth world and what that means. And now what I would take it back to is, why did the language of evidence feel important in the 20th century, and why does it feel unimportant now? So especially in the Cold War. So why were the communists still respectful of the language of evidence, even as they lied, while Putin doesn't seem to care, or Trump doesn't seem to care? And I relate that to that in the late 20th century, there were still rational ideas of history, or that claim to be rational, whether it's scientific Marxism or democratic capitalism, that were sort of, they had an idea of a rational future they were trying to ascertain. Now, that's a deeply, deeply emotional state. If you look at Nazi or Soviet propaganda, a lot of it is completely about the emotion of being part of history. Actually, that's one of their main claims. And that you will be able to sacrifice yourself because you're part of a greater historical story that is leading to a utopia. But it was a utopia that was meant to be grounded in a pseudoscientific language, in which respected the language of evidence. You were meant to prove that you were getting somewhere. And there was a relationship between that architecture of evidence and people's sense of purpose and stuff. And I suppose what's fallen away is that sense of a future, that sense of a rational future that we're headed to. And we could go about the many reasons that happened, whether that was undermined from the realm of ideas through various philosophical currents, or whether it was just the reality of your kids are getting poorer than you. So all the stuff about, like, we're heading to a utopian globalized economic future together, that kind of fell apart for most people. So it could be a mixture of all those factors. It could be something to do with the nature of media. Newspapers and novels were very good at structuring time and a sense of time and purpose. Newspapers came out every day, structuring your life and giving you a sense of ordered reality and a sense of progress, while social media doesn't do that. Social media mixes time up. You have no idea whether what you're seeing is new or old. So all these factors have contributed to a breakdown of a rational idea of time and an idea of history and your place in it. And so that's what I mean. And when that's fallen away, when those ideological constructs have fallen away, all that's left is identity. And maybe emotion is the wrong word. Maybe the better words to use is identity. But identity, I always look at not as a sociologist, but much more from the point of view of I don't know, psychoanalysis, psychology. So we need identity to protect ourselves from a world of chaos. So, and in those identity constructs, it's much, even more than it was before, about who you love and who you hate, who's the in-group and who's the out-group. Now, that was always there. You know, the Nazis obviously was there, the communists was always there. That was always there, but now it's kind of been made naked. You know, it's just that now. So that's what I meant when I used, maybe the word emotion is the wrong one to use. The psychological underpinnings of ideology have remained, while the ideological bits have sort of withered away. Maybe there's an honesty to that. Maybe this was what was always beneath the ideology of empire, the ideology of communism. I mean, it's quite nakedly there in the ideology of Nazism, that it's all about in-groups and out-groups and belonging. But that now it's kind of all that's left, just the psychological, pulsating, bloody heart is all that's left, and the ideological body has withered away.
Speaking of identities and in groups and out groups, you know, when in your first book, you mentioned how even though you were born in the Soviet Union, you sort of climbed up the ladder of Russian state television because you were British, and it just seemed like you might know more. The next question in the chat is sort of tapping into this idea, and the question is, how do Russian citizens react when you speak to them from an outside perspective, especially when you're talking about misinformation about Russia's past and propaganda in Russia?
Well, there is no one Russian audience, is there? I mean, there are many different ones. My first book wasn't translated into Russian. My second book was, and did very, very well, apparently. But in the tiny sort of like world of, in the small world of people who think about these things. And I don't think I ever go beyond that sort of world.